This is Unit 5, Level 1, Classifying Triangles. We've already talked a little bit in class about angles, and we reviewed angles from prior grade levels. And we know a triangle, with that prefix tri, just means three angles. So it's a shape that has three sides and three angles. And what we do to classify them, and we know from science, classifying is just putting them in groups, and we're putting them in a group based on the triangles, that they're all triangles, that we can give them both a first and a last name. So we're going to think about the way that we name them as a first and a last name. One name we give them is based on their sides. And we have three words here. We have equilateral, isosceles, and scalene. So that's going to be their first name, either going to be an equilateral, isosceles, or scalene. Their last name is going to come from the angle, either acute, right, or obtuse. So let's talk about them each individually, and then we'll talk about how we name them, putting them back together. So we first must understand what each of these words mean. So we're going to start with the sides, and we're going to start with that word equilateral. Equal, if we notice the beginning of that, it's kind of like equal. Equilateral just means that all three sides are equal. So it's going to have three sides equal. And it'll look something like maybe that, if we pretend all those equal. Now sometimes you'll notice they put lines through the sides. That just means that they are congruent. We've talked about that word congruent before, but congruent just means that they're the same size. So if it has three sides equal, that means it has three congruent sides, and that would be an equilateral triangle. Isosceles is when we have, you may have guessed it, two sides equal. Two sides equal, so it may look something like this, where these two sides are equal. And that's called an isosceles triangle. Two sides are equal. Now on a scalene, you may have guessed it, it means no sides are equal. Oops. Pretend that's a straight line. So on a scalene, none of the sides are equal. And so they may show that by putting one line through here, two through here, and then three through here. Because they don't have the same markings, that means none of those sides are equal. Or, as we said earlier, congruent. So when we have three sides equal, we have our equilateral triangle. When we have two sides equal, we have an isosceles triangle. And when we have no sides equal, we have what's called a scalene triangle. That's how we get the first name of the triangle. The second name is going to come from, or the last name is going to come from the angles. And every triangle is going to have at least two acute angles. Acute are those, oh, look at those little acute angles. They're those ones that are less than 90 degrees. So on an acute triangle, all three angles are going to be acute. So we can't just look at one angle, we have to look at all three angles. If all three angles are acute, which means that they are less than 90 degrees, then it's going to be an acute triangle. Now, like I said before, all triangles are going to have at least two acute angles. So on a right triangle, it's going to have those two acute angles, but you may have guessed it by the name that third angle to make up the triangle is going to be a right angle. Now you may recall that a right angle is typically shown with that little box in the corner. We know that's right. So this triangle that I just drew would be a right triangle. If it was acute, all three angles would be acute. Notice that they all have at least two acute. That's going to be true for the obtuse. It's going to have two acute angles, which means they're less than 90 degrees. But one, as the name suggests, one is going to be an obtuse angle. put up there 90 degrees for right. So an obtuse angle is going to be, if an acute is less than 90, a right is equal to 90, then you may have guessed it that an obtuse is going to be greater than 90 degrees. That's where that mouth is open really wide. That would be an obtuse angle. So the triangle I just drew would be an obtuse triangle. So what we have here is that we can describe these triangles in two ways. We can describe and give them a name based on their sides, and we can describe and give them a name based on their angles. So let's go through a couple of examples. Okay, I have three triangles, in front of you, A, B, and C. And I drew them to my best of my ability. I put some markings on them to help us know whether or not sides were equal. So they are not drawn to scale. But as I told you before, every triangle is going to have two names. So for A, it's going to have two names, B, it's going to have two names, and C is going to have two names. One of those names is based on the sides, and one is based on the angles. So let's start with that first name with the angles. So when I look at this first triangle, letter A, I notice that it has this box in the corner. That box in the corner, remember, tells me that it's a right angle. So if it has one right angle, it becomes a right triangle. On this particular one, these angles, I don't see any boxes that would tell me it's a right triangle, and they don't look like it's kind of like the corner of a square. They all look pretty small. So three small angles would be three under 90 degree angles, which would be acute. So this is going to be an acute triangle. On this last one, I noticed that these two angles are acute, but I noticed this angle right here is really big. That big angle is greater than 90 degrees, and we know when it's greater than 90 degrees, it's an obtuse angle. So already, pretty quickly, I'm able to determine the first name. Letter A has a name that for its first name is right. Letter B is acute, and letter C is obtuse. Now let's look at the sides. When I go back to A, I notice that these two sides, based on the markings, are congruent or equal. When two sides are equal, that's going to be an isosceles triangle. So the name of letter A is a right isosceles triangle. Now, if you mess up and switch the names, that's okay. It really doesn't matter which name comes first or which name comes second. So this could be an isosceles right triangle. It's just important that we get the two names correct. On B, I noticed that all three sides have similar markings. That means all three sides are equal or congruent. That means that this is an equilateral triangle. So it's an acute equilateral triangle. And last but not least, I noticed that these three sides all have different markings on C. Therefore, when all three sides are not equal at all, it's a scalene triangle. So letter C is an obtuse scalene triangle. There I've named all three triangles. Now, it won't always work out this way. You won't always have, you can have the names intermixed a little bit more, but you'll always have one for the sides and one for the sides and one for the angles. Okay, this is Unit 5, Level 1, classifying triangles.